The woods held a silence that did not feel empty but waiting, as though the trees themselves leaned closer to listen for what might pass beneath their darkened boughs. Snow had melted in patches, leaving the ground slick with mud and needles, the scent of pine sharp in the cool air. A lone rider moved through those shadows, his horse breathing clouds of steam into the stillness. The man upon the saddle carried himself with the tired dignity of one who had walked long roads inside his own chest. His 30 years were not many, yet solitude had aged him more surely than time. There was no song in his throat, no whistle to the rhythm of hooves, only the steady patience of a man who knew silence better than company. He had not expected to find anything alive in that stretch of forest. Game had grown scarce, travelers avoided it, and the land itself seemed to prefer its loneliness. Yet the sound came faint, almost swallowed by the creak of trees in the wind, something like a broken breath, fragile and human. He reined his horse to a halt, listening. Again it came, thin as paper tearing, and his body tightened with the old instinct of someone who had stumbled upon trouble before. Sliding from the saddle, he let the reins fall slack and stepped forward, boots sinking into damp soil. The sound drew him deeper between the trees until at last he saw her. A young woman collapsed against a fallen trunk, her hair a wild halo of copper catching the last light that filtered through the branches. Her dress, though once of finer cloth, was torn and muddied, one sleeve dark with the slow stain of blood. Her eyes half opened, startling green against the pallor of her face, and they fixed on him not with gratitude but with wary defiance, as if even from the ground she would fight being pitted. He crouched near, lowering his voice to something gentler than he had used in years. "You're hurt." She pressed her lips tight, as though words might cost her too much strength. When he reached for her arm, she flinched, not at pain, but at trust. The look in her gaze was older than her 22 years, a look he recognized, the weight of promises broken by others. He did not argue, nor did he leave. He tore a strip from his own kerchief, and pressed it carefully to her wound, speaking softly as though each phrase might coax her to stay awake. "You're not alone anymore." The words left him before he thought them through, an instinct older than pride. They were not a vow of love, not yet, but something simpler, a promise to remain. Her lashes fluttered, a mix of disbelief and stubborn fire, but she did not push his hand away. He eased his coat from his shoulders, wrapped it around her slight frame, and with effort lifted her against him. She was light, but weakness made her heavy, every step sinking deeper into his resolve. The horse waited where he had left it, patient and silent. He hoisted her into the saddle first, holding her steady, then swung up behind. As they moved through the trees, the world grew darker, the air sharper, yet his chest carried a warmth unfamiliar in so many barren years. She leaned faintly against him, not willingly, not fully, but because she could not hold herself upright. That small weight was more than company, it was trust, however fragile, placed upon his shoulders. By the time the line of trees began to thin, night was pressing down and the stars were pricking their way across the sky. He could feel her pulse flutter weak beneath his hand where it steadied her, like the wing-beat of some frightened bird refusing to yield to silence. She whispered once, words too faint to gather, but the sound alone told him she had not surrendered to the dark. When at last the lights of his cabin flickered dim in the distance, relief washed through him, quiet but deep. He had gone into the woods expecting only his own company, and he returned carrying something far more fragile and far more alive. The forest had given him a secret, one he could not walk away from, and as he guided the horse onward he felt the shape of change begin to press against the walls of his solitude. That night would not be the end of her story, nor his. It was only the first breath of something that would demand more from both of them than either could yet know. But as the door of the cabin loomed closer and the weight of her head grew heavier against his chest, one truth rooted itself in him like seed in soil. He would not leave her, not to the cold, not to the silence, not to the fate of being forgotten in the woods. And though she could not yet believe it, her life had turned a corner in that moment, bound now to the quiet strength of a man who carried loneliness like an old wound and who had just discovered the courage it takes to share it. The cabin waited at the edge of the woods, a square of timber pressed against the loneliness of open country. Its walls bore the mark of years of storms, its roof sagged under weight of snow, yet smoke rose gently from the chimney as if the place still believed in warmth. The cowboy pushed the door with his shoulder, carrying her inside with care, the hinges groaning as though disturbed from slumber. The fire in the hearth had burned low, embers glowing like tired eyes, but even that dim heat was a comfort against the raw bite of the night. He laid her gently on the cot pushed against the wall. The coat slipped from her shoulders, leaving her pale against the rough blanket, a figure of fragility and stubborn spirit. Her breathing was shallow, uneven, each inhale testing the thread that tethered her to this world. He crouched beside her, striking tinder, coaxing the fire back to life until flames lifted and shadows danced once more across the walls. In the fuller light he studied her features. Youth had not spared her from hardship. Her cheekbones held sharp lines of hunger, her hands bore the faint calluses of work, yet her hair spilled across the pillow like copper washed in flame. She stirred, half aware, eyes opening in a flicker of green that seemed both wild and weary. He spoke softly, his voice low, a sound meant not to startle. "You're safe here." She blinked, the words hanging between them. Safe. Perhaps she had not heard such a word without condition in many years. When she tried to shift, pain drew a hiss from her lips, her hand pressing against her side where blood had dried stiff against the torn fabric. He fetched water, dipping a rag and cleaning the wound as best he could, though his hands were more used to reins and rope than the delicate work of tending. Still he was careful, apologizing under his breath whenever she winced. She did not answer, but her gaze lingered on him longer each time, as though measuring whether the rough edges of this stranger hid cruelty or care. At last, wrapped in clean cloth and laid beneath heavier blankets, she let her eyes close again. He sat near the fire, watching the flames rise. Sleep did not claim him quickly. His mind turned restless, circling around the mystery she carried into his solitude. What path had led her broken into those woods? Who had left her there? The answers did not matter tonight. What mattered was the quiet sound of her breathing, steady now, as though the cabin itself had promised to guard her through the dark. When morning came, pale and cold, she stirred at the smell of coffee on the stove. She pushed herself upright, groaning softly. He turned, setting a tin cup in her hands before she could protest. The steam rose between them, and for a moment her eyes softened, suspicion easing though not disappearing. She sipped, slow and deliberate, as though testing not only the drink but the intention behind it. Her voice was hoarse when it came, edged with the music of another land. "You could have left me." He met her gaze without flinching. "I didn't." She looked down into the cup, the heat fogging her lashes. That simple answer seemed to hold more weight than any elaborate vow. She had been left before, perhaps by more men than one, and his refusal to speak excuses, only fact, carved a space of trust she did not yet know how to fill. Days passed in that rhythm. He split wood, repaired the fence, cooked stews that filled the cabin with a smell of something richer than hunger. She watched him move, slow but sure, his silence never cold. He spoke when needed, but more often he listened. She began to share fragments of her past, unspooling them like torn threads she had carried too long. She had crossed the ocean with hope. A man had promised her a future, fields, a family, a home, but instead she had found emptiness, betrayal, and the cruel measure of a world that did not soften for women without protection. He had walked away one night, leaving her with nothing but bruises and silence. She had wandered, too proud to beg, too fearful to return, until the woods took her strength and left her to be found, or not. He listened without judgment, his eyes steady on the fire. When she faltered, ashamed of her own story, he shook his head gently. "None of that makes you less." The words startled her more than comforted, for she had heard only the opposite from the world. At night, when the wind pressed hard against the cabin, they spoke in low tones. She asked about his life, but he gave only pieces. He had known loss, that much was clear, though he did not clothe it in details. She guessed at a family buried, at dreams laid aside, and she did not press further. Some silences are not meant to be broken at once. One evening, snow began to fall again, heavy and relentless. He worked to secure the roof while she, still weak but stubborn, managed to mend her dress with what scraps of thread remained. When he returned inside, shaking the snow from his hat, he found her standing by the fire, the garment spread across her lap. Her hands trembled as she traced the embroidery, delicate patterns stitched back when her heart had still been unbroken. It was then he saw her not just as wounded, but as someone fighting to remember who she had been before betrayal. The sight pierced him deeper than pity could. She was not asking to be rescued. She was asking only not to be forgotten. Their eyes met across the flicker of firelight. Something passed there, unspoken, a recognition of two souls who had both carried loneliness until it threatened to consume them. He did not step closer, and she did not reach out, yet the silence between them grew thick with meaning. That night, as she lay beneath the blankets and he sat again by the fire, she whispered into the dimness, her voice barely louder than the crackle of wood. "You said you wouldn't leave me." His answer came slow, firm, almost like prayer. "I won't." She turned her face into the pillow, tears she would not admit to wetting the fabric. For the first time in years, she believed someone might mean it. The fire burned down, the snow kept falling, and though their words were few, something stronger than speech was taking root in that small cabin. The world outside remained harsh, waiting with its judgments and dangers, but here, for now, there was shelter. And as the night deepened, each of them felt it, the sense that solitude had been cracked open, and that what had entered might change the course of both their lives, though neither yet dared to name it. The thaw came slowly, the snow loosening its grip on the earth, but with each drip from the eaves and each patch of mud revealed, the world outside the cabin grew restless. In town, where voices carried faster than truth, whispers began to curl like smoke. A stranger woman, Irish by her tongue, hidden in the cabin of a cowboy who had long kept to himself. Such stories invited speculation, and speculation sharpened easily into judgment. She sensed it before he spoke of it. One afternoon, when he returned from trading for flour and salt, his shoulders carried more than supplies. His silence was thicker, his jaw set. She pressed him gently, and at last he admitted what the townsfolk had begun to murmur. Some called her a burden. Others claimed she must have lured him, or worse. He spoke without bitterness, but she felt shame coil in her chest like smoke against lungs. The world was reminding her of its cruelty, and she feared she was dragging him into it. That night, while he chopped wood outside, she sat by the fire with her mended dress folded in her lap. Her fingers pressed the embroidery until her nails hurt, as though holding tighter might keep her from breaking apart. When he returned, snow dusting his coat, he saw her face turned away and understood without asking. He set the wood down and knelt before her, his rough hands covering hers. "The world can say what it likes. I see what's true." His voice carried no flourish, no promise of romance, but the certainty in it steadied her trembling. Days passed, yet the unease did not fade. And then came the moment when shadows of the past stepped back into her path. A man appeared at the edge of the clearing, riding with the swagger of one who believed possession gave him rights. She recognized him before he spoke, and her breath faltered. He was the one who had promised her safety across the ocean, who had abandoned her with nothing but hunger and regret. Time had not improved him. His face bore the slack confidence of a weak heart that survived on the control of others. The cowboy stepped out of the cabin, hand near the butt of his revolver but his stance calm. The man sneered, speaking loud enough for the trees to hear. "She belongs to me." That was the claim, as though her body and soul were property to be reclaimed. She flinched at the word, not from fear of him alone but from the memories it dragged forward, the nights of silence, the mornings of emptiness, the betrayal that had nearly broken her spirit. The cowboy did not move aside. "She does not belong to anyone." His words were flat, like stone. The man laughed, mocking the simplicity, but there was a tremor beneath his bravado. Weak men often feared what they could not sway. He spat into the snow, promising he would return, and with a tug of reins turned back toward town. When the sound of hooves faded, she sank onto the step, her hands covering her face. He crouched beside her, not touching until she lifted her head. "I can't face him again," she whispered. Her voice cracked with both fear and anger. He studied her quietly, then said, "You don't have to face him alone." The words were steady, carrying the same weight they had the night he first found her. The days after were thick with tension. Rain came, steady and relentless, drumming on the roof, streaking the window panes until the world outside blurred into gray. Inside, they lived in the hush of shared survival. She confessed fears in fragments, of being pulled back into a life she had escaped, of being discarded once more, of never being seen for who she truly was. He listened, his silence never cruel, his presence like the earth beneath her feet. On one such night, when the rain fell hardest and thunder rolled across the horizon, her strength finally faltered. She sat by the fire, shoulders trembling, words spilling out without her guard. "I've been waiting all this time for someone to stay. Every man who swore to protect me left when it mattered." Her voice cracked on the last syllable, and she turned her face away. He moved closer, not with suddenness but with a steady calm. His hand found hers, rough skin against delicate fingers. He did not speak first, letting her weeping quiet before he whispered, "I won't leave you alone." The words had been said before, but now they held the fullness of meaning. It was not a promise tossed into the air, it was a vow pressed into the marrow of her fear. She stared at him through tear-blurred lashes, searching for the flaw, the hesitation. But his gaze met hers with unflinching steadiness. For the first time, she let her weight lean fully into his shoulder, her heart accepting the shelter she had longed for. Outside, the storm raged, but inside, something shifted. It was not love declared in fiery passion. It was something deeper, quieter, the slow rooting of trust in soil that had been barren for too long. She knew the man from her past would return, that the world would not allow peace without struggle. Yet she also knew, as her hand remained clasped in his, that she no longer faced it as the abandoned girl left bleeding in the woods. She faced it as a woman who had been seen, believed, and chosen by someone whose silence carried more loyalty than any vow she had heard before. The rain eased before dawn, leaving the air heavy and the earth soaked, but the fire within the cabin still glowed. Their hearts, though wary, had begun to beat in rhythm, steady as the drip of water from the eaves. For now they had found a kind of peace, though both sensed the greater storm waiting beyond the horizon. And as morning light pressed against the window, she lifted her head from his shoulder and whispered something she had not spoken in years. "Thank you for staying." It was not the end of her fear, nor the end of the danger that circled closer, but it was the first true step toward believing that perhaps, this time, the promise would not break. The days of uneasy quiet could not last. Word in town thickened like storm clouds, muttered over whiskey glasses and whispered across dry goods counters. Men who found comfort in judgment began to gather their voices, and with them came the one who had abandoned her, the man who once called her his and now returned not out of love but out of pride wounded by another's defiance. When he rode again toward the cabin, he did not ride alone. She saw them first, a dark knot of figures at the edge of the clearing, torches flickering in the dusk. Her hand froze where it rested on the table, her breath caught. He stepped to the window, the lines of his face sharpening, not with surprise but with a calm that came from having expected this moment all along. They came forward slowly, boots crunching the crust of half-frozen ground, voices low but edged with threat. The man at their front called out, his tone dripping with false authority. "You've got something that belongs to me. Bring her out and we'll walk away." The words reached her ears like chains rattling, and for a moment the old terror surged, the fear of being dragged back into silence and cruelty. The cowboy opened the door and stepped outside, the cold striking his face, the fire of torches glinting in his eyes. His revolver rested at his side, but his voice was stronger than steel. "She is not yours. She is no man's possession. She stands where she chooses, and she chose not you." A murmur rippled through the gathered men. Some shifted uneasily, others sneered. The first man's face twisted, anger covering cowardice. "Don't talk like she's more than what she is," he spat. "She's nothing without a man." His words cut the night, but their venom faltered against the stillness that followed. The cowboy's voice came again, low but carrying. "You see weakness because you've never known the strength of someone who's endured more than you could bear. She is not nothing. She is more than any of us, and I will stand here until you see it, or until you fall." The air held a fragile pause. Some of the men lowered their eyes, doubt creeping in where cruelty had lived. But the first man, unwilling to yield, lunged forward, his hand going to his belt. In a flash, steel glinted and chaos broke. The fight was not long, but it was fierce. The cowboy moved with the raw instinct of a man who fought not for pride but for life itself. Blows landed, bodies collided in the snow, breath turned to steam. Torches wavered, shouts rose. He struck not to kill but to protect, his every motion steady, purposeful. When the dust of struggle settled, the first man lay in the snow, groaning, stripped of his bravado. The others, their courage broken, began to drift back, muttering excuses, shamed by the strength of one who had stood without fear. She rushed from the doorway, skirts heavy with snow, and knelt beside him. His lip was split, his knuckles raw, his breath harsh, but his eyes met hers with calm certainty. "You're safe," he whispered, as if the words themselves could hold her upright. She pressed her trembling hands against his face, tears falling freely now, not from fear but from the flood of relief. Together they rose, his arms steady around her waist. The clearing was emptying, the last of the intruders fading into the dark, leaving only the sound of torches crackling as they died in the snow. The man who had once claimed her now lay abandoned by the very followers he had stirred, his defeat as complete as his cowardice. Inside the cabin, she guided him to the fire, tending his bruises with care. Her hands were gentle, but her eyes burned with something fierce, something new. For years she had carried the weight of being less, of being discarded. Tonight she had seen that weight shattered, not only by his defense but by her own refusal to be taken. She looked at him as the firelight played across his tired face. "You fought for me." He shook his head slowly. "No. I fought with you." The difference mattered. She was not a rescued damsel, but a woman whose worth had been named aloud, whose strength had been seen. Silence settled, but it was the silence of peace, not fear. She leaned closer, resting her forehead against his, breathing the truth that had lived unspoken between them. "I don't need saving anymore. But I'm glad you never left." He closed his eyes, a rough laugh escaping, edged with tenderness. "You were never a burden. You were the reason I remembered how to live." The fire burned low, its glow wrapping them in quiet warmth. Outside, the night stretched endless and cold, but the cabin held something that no storm could touch. Two souls, once fractured and alone, had chosen to stand together, to build from the ashes of betrayal something steadier than vows, something as simple and unbreakable as staying. And if ever one were to sit by a hearth in years to come, telling stories of the Wild West, they might say that love is not always found in grand gestures or sudden fire. Sometimes it comes like shelter in a storm, like a hand that refuses to let go, like a voice that whispers in the loneliest night, "I won't leave you alone."